In a few moments, I will sign a historic executive order instituting reciprocal tariffs on countries throughout the world.
Donald Trump's tariffs war continues to hit global markets.
Die jüngsten Zollentscheidungen des US-Präsidenten halte ich für grundfalsch.
In the last few minutes, US President Donald Trump has announced sweeping tariffs on goods imported into the United States from all countries.
La guerra comercial abierta por el presidente Trump es una pésima noticia para el mundo.
The decision announced last night is both brutal and unfounded.
The Federal Council has taken note of the U.S. decisions regarding tariffs.
President Trump's announcement of universal tariffs on the whole world, including the European Union, is a major blow.
I always say tariffs is the most beautiful word to me in the dictionary.
Europe has long been watching the trade storm between the two sides of the Atlantic, with concern a protectionist wave launched by the United States under the name of Trump tariffs first targeted China, then Canada and Mexico, and now the European Union. On April 2, 2025, the White House announced a new round of tariffs on cars and parts imported from Europe with an average tariff of around 20%. This move angered Europe, which was already reeling from tariffs on steel and aluminum. At the end of 2024, the European Commission issued a very harsh statement on April 3, saying, "We will stand up to the trade injustices caused by American policies." Commission President Ursula von der Leyen even raised the issue at a recent summit in Central Asia, saying, "If bilateral trade liberalization gives way to unilateral impositions, we will not refrain from reciprocal measures." Some see this as a turning point for Europe, but which items could the EU retaliate against the United States? Which countries are spearheading this plan? And which brands in particular will face new customs burdens? European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen harshly criticized US President Donald Trump's imposition of 20% tariffs on EU goods, saying the bloc was ready to respond. The previous day, Trump included the European Union in a group of 60 countries subject to higher reciprocal tariffs, along with China, India, Japan, and Korea, and subjected the rest of the world to 10% tariffs. This is America's biggest swing towards protectionism since the Great Depression of the 1930s. Von der Leyen said, Trump's tariffs would have dire consequences for consumers and businesses that have prospered by trading with the United States. Since World War II as the world's largest single market, the European Union must also defend itself against the deep disruption to global trade that would result from Trump's isolation of the United States. Von der Leyen continued, "There seems to be no order in disorder. There is no clear path through the complexity and chaos that is being created, because all U.S. trading partners will be affected." In a statement from Samanta, Uzbekistan, when she was attending the summit, von der Leyen emphasized, "We are already finalizing the first package of countermeasures in response to the tariffs on steel, and are preparing to take further countermeasures to protect our interests and businesses if negotiations fail." Von der Leyen also emphasized that as the bloc prepares for a flood of cheaper exports from China and elsewhere that will be excluded from the U.S. market, we will also closely monitor what the indirect effects of these tariffs might be, because we cannot absorb global overcapacity, and we will not accept dumping on our market. Von der Leyen warned of the impact on consumers and businesses of Trump's dismantling of the global trade order. Millions of citizens will face higher grocery bills. Medicines and transportation will be more expensive. Inflation will rise. The cost of doing business with the U.S. will rise significantly. Bank on Wednesday cut its GDP growth forecast for the Eurozone next year from 1.4% to 1% due to the impact of the tariffs, and revised its outlook for this year. Von der Leyen, however, refrained from initiating immediate countermeasures on behalf of the EU member states that the Commission represents on trade issues. Trade negotiator Maros Shevchenko will meet with the EU's 27 ambassadors on Friday. So which products could the EU impose tariffs on? Which countries will lead the way? And which brands will be at the center of these developments? In fact, the European Union's trade with the US has accelerated significantly. In the last decade, in 2024, total trade in goods and services between the two sides reached a record high of $1 trillion, with giant economies such as Germany and France accounting for a significant portion of this trade. The U.S. administration's so-called Trump tariffs unilaterally shook the structure of this market. Initially, the tariffs on steel and aluminum alarmed European producers, but the tariffs on automobiles and automotive parts on April 2nd were perhaps the biggest blow. Because countries like Germany, France, and Italy have been exporting their vehicles and vehicle parts to the US market for a long time, without any problems now. A wave of tariffs of 20%, up to 25% on some items is putting a severe dent in this order. According to leaks from the European Commission's backstage, Brussels is now seriously considering the idea of hitting back. We will no longer follow unilateral escalation. We will use the tools at our disposal to protect our products. The Commission Vice President said on the evening of April 3rd, the question of which products will be the primary target is on the agenda. Industry representatives are aware that automotive, pharmaceuticals, textiles, electronics, steel, aluminum, and even alcoholic beverages are on the retaliation list because these American-origin items reach serious sales figures in the European market. Von der Leyen said, U.S. sales of goods to Europe exceeded $360 billion in 2024. We are working on options that could restrict this by nearly half. If these words turn into practice, tariffs in the 20–25% range could put American exporters in a very difficult situation. At this point, the stance of leading EU economies such as Germany, France, Italy, and Spain will be decisive. Germany is the heart of European manufacturing, especially in the automotive and machinery industries. Germany, which exports $110 billion a year to the UN, is warming to the idea of retaliation against US-made cars and parts. That's because Berlin says its exporters have been hit hard by Washington's steel and auto parts tariffs. If America is attacking our automotive sector, we must respond in kind, Germany's economy minister said on April 3rd. This means that even an export giant like Germany is losing patience. While Germany's exports climbed to $210 billion, France's share was around $80 billion. Italy and Spain also had a strong position in the U.S. market, with exports of $50 billion and $40 billion respectively. However, the so-called Trump tariffs imposed by the U.S. administration not only cracked this huge market, but also pushed the EU to make retaliation plans. On April 3, 2025, the Vice President of the European Commission commented, "Let no one think that we will not follow the same path. We have to protect our own producers. The question is which products will be targeted first." According to backstage information leaked from the EU automotive, pharmaceuticals, textiles, electronics, steel, aluminum, and alcoholic beverages are high on the retaliation list. It is known that Europe is a huge market for American manufacturers. It is estimated that U.S. companies export more than $16 billion a year to Europe, especially in industrial inputs such as steel and aluminum. If Brussels imposes tariffs of 25 to 30% on these items, the competitiveness of U.S. producers could weaken. On April 3, 2025, the EU Commission's Trade Commissioner warned the U.S., "We can take equivalent measures in critical areas such as aluminum and steel. It is not difficult to find alternative sources of supply." One of the most curious issues is the sanctions on the automotive sector. In addition to Mr. Trump's previously announced 25% tariffs on auto imports, which went into effect today, imported cars will face universal tariffs of 10%. Experts said that some U.S.-made vehicles contain parts imported from other countries, and these parts will face new tariffs, increasing the purchase price of these cars. According to an April 2nd estimate by the Anderson Economic Group, American consumers could have to pay a surcharge of $20,500 to $5,000 for the lowest-cost American cars, and up to $20,000 for some imported models. The EU is preparing to play its trump card in this scenario. German auto giants are a critical element of transatlantic trade, but now Germany is saying, since the U.S. has raised tariffs on steel and auto parts, we will impose additional tariffs on vehicles and spare parts coming from the U.S. Of course, Germany's rhetoric has attracted a lot of attention. In 2024, Germany imported $16 billion worth of automotive products from the U.S. Most of this figure is made up of American pickup models, sports cars, and some spare parts. If the Berlin administration imposes tariffs exceeding 20% on these items, brands such as Ford and General Motors may have a hard time in the European market. The situation is similar on the French front. While there was already a modest interest in U.S. automobiles, in the French market, American brands had a partial share in wine and luxury goods. Now, Paris has publicly stated that it is considering targeting U.S. wine and spirits bourbon. Whiskey and other American spirits are also on the table. We will draw up a clear list in coordination with EU partners. In response, Gabriel Picard, president of industry group FEVS, told France's BFM television that French wine and spirit sales to the U.S. are expected to fall by at least 20% due to the new tariffs. Phoebe said in a statement that it deeply regretted the U.S. decision, adding that the decision penalizes both French wine and spirits exporters and their American partners, and above all American consumers themselves. France's exports are expected to fall by around 800 million euros, while those of the 27 countries in the EU are expected to fall by 1.6 billion euros. It said. The group representing exporters continued its statement as follows. Such a decline will have a major impact on employment and the sector's economy. According to a statement from the French presidency, President Emmanuel Macron will meet with representatives of business sectors affected by the new taxes at the Elysee Palace on Thursday. In the past, Europe has raised taxes on whiskey from the United States in retaliation, a move that created political pressure in some southern states. The scenario is similar. Wine and liquor producers, particularly in France and Italy, have a strong lobby, so a retaliatory move could also put political pressure on the U.S. on the Italian front. The option of imposing additional tariffs on U.S. imports in the textile and apparel sector is being discussed. The share of American-branded sportswear and denim products in the Italian market has increased in recent years. If the Rome administration switches to a tax bracket of around 25% on these items, a loss of billions of dollars could occur in the American apparel industry. In 2020, for Italy's textile and apparel imports from the U.S. amounted to around $5 billion, with a significant portion of this figure coming from famous American brands, such as shirts, pants, and sneakers. On April 3, 2025, Italy's economy minister emphasized this option, saying we can take steps in clothing and fashion products. Spain, on the other hand, is considering sanctions on agricultural and food products. Corn, soy, and meat products from the U.S. are among the items used in Spain's feed and food industry. In 2020, Spain imported $3.5 billion in these categories. Now the Madrid government is thinking, if necessary, we will play the tariff card for agricultural products. In addition, if Spain's wine and olive oil exports are restricted by the United States, Europe could play its trump card and retaliate against American agricultural products. Industry experts say large agricultural producers like Spain and Italy would not hesitate to use the weapon of tariffs to put direct pressure on the U.S. agricultural lobby. Nordic countries like Sweden also have close ties with the U.S. in technology and machinery exports. On the other hand, tariffs on American technology brands are also among the EU's options. Leaked plans from the European Commission suggest that additional tariffs of 15 to 25% could be imposed on U.S. products in certain electronic devices and semiconductor components. This attack could put pressure on Washington, as it would affect U.S. chipmakers and major technology companies. An EU Commission announcement the other day said, "We cannot accept unilateral impositions on technology transfer, and if necessary, we will impose additional tariffs on sensitive items." Irish Prime Minister Michael Martin said, "Tariffs were bad for the world economy and would damage transatlantic relations." Martin continued, "We see no justification for this. More than 4 billion euros in goods and services are traded daily between the EU and the US. Disrupting this deeply integrated relationship benefits no one." Swedish Prime Minister Ulf Kristersson made similar comments, arguing that tariffs are contrary to the free enterprise and competition that laid the foundations for Western success. Kristersson continued, "This is why Americans can listen to music on Swedish Spotify, and we Swedes can listen to the same music on our American iPhones. That's why I deeply regret the path the US has taken by trying to limit trade with higher tariffs." Finnish Prime Minister Petri Orpo said the tariffs were alarming. Orpo continued, "There are no winners in a trade war. Businesses, consumers, and economic growth suffer. The EU is ready to respond and negotiate. We support this effort. Finland is ready as part of the Union." Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk called for truly and fully reciprocal tariffs between Europe and the US. Adequate decisions are needed. Tusk added. Danish Foreign Minister Lars Løkke Rasmussen this week criticized Washington's aggressive rhetoric about taking control of Greenland, Denmark's autonomous territory, saying everyone loses in a trade war between the US and Europe. Rasmussen continued, "Instead of building walls, We must break down barriers. Europe will stand united. Europe will respond firmly and proportionately. Norwegian Trade Minister Cecilia Mapsis said Trump's decision to impose a 15% tariff on non-EU Norway would have a critical impact on the country's economy. The U.S. imports about 80% of its coffee beans from Latin American countries, such as Brazil and Colombia, according to the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Both countries are included in Mr. Trump's reciprocal tariffs and face rates of 10% each. Chocolate is another major Latin American import, largely because the U.S. climate is largely unsuitable for growing cocoa beans. According to the U.S., countries exporting cocoa beans to the country include Côte d'Ivoire and Ecuador. These countries will face reciprocal tariffs of 21% and 10%, respectively. On top of this, a new 31% reciprocal tariff will be imposed on Swiss imports to the U.S. This will affect a wide range of brands, from affordable brands like Swatch to expensive watches like Rolex. A closer look at the figures shows that Germany's annual imports to the U.S. are around $85 billion, France's $45 billion, Italy's $25 billion, Spain's $15 billion, and Sweden's $8 billion. In total, these 5 countries account for more than 60% of U.S. imports in the EU. If a joint retaliatory decision is taken under the umbrella of Brussels, the biggest share will be shaped by the moves of these countries. U.S. exports of industrial products, such as steel and aluminum, to Europe amount to $16 billion, while automotive and parts exports reach $26 billion. Pharmaceuticals and chemical products also play an important role, with a share of $20 billion. If the European Union were to impose simultaneous tariffs on all these items, a trade volume of over $60 billion for U.S. exporters could shrink sharply. This data makes it clear how cautious the U.S. needs to be. However, Trump does not plan to back down on tariffs. Another critical issue in terms of tariffs is medicines. On the pharmaceutical side, France and Germany in particular import heavily from American pharmaceutical giants, from counter-treatments to advanced biotechnology products. The U.S. has extremely strong brands in many fields. In 2024, the EU imported $45 billion worth of pharmaceutical products from the U.S. If the European Commission also puts pharmaceuticals on the retaliation list, European health systems, which already complain about high prices in this area, may move to a more costly picture with new taxes. This would put a strain on both American pharmaceutical companies and the treatment budgets of European patients. Nevertheless, Brussels is acting with the approach that, if they put obstacles in steel, automobiles, and agriculture, we will put sensitive points on our agenda. Textiles and electronic products are among the important items that stand out. U.S. textile and apparel exports to Europe amounted to $12 billion. In the 2024, a significant portion of this belongs to sportswear and casual wear brands. American brands have gained a significant share in the sportswear market. In Europe, if the EU decides to impose an additional tax of 25% on average, these brands may be forced to increase prices through their importers, and their competitiveness may decrease. In electronics, U.S. companies export around $18 billion a year, including a wide range of products, from high-tech devices to software licenses. We are creating a list of sensitive items. The European Union says we cannot remain silent in the face of unilateral impositions on technology, an EU official said. The leading role of countries like Germany and France could accelerate the retaliatory process. On April 2, 2025, Berlin described the U.S. tariffs as extremely unilateral and unfair. Germany's economy minister made a statement as follows: "We cannot remain indifferent to measures targeting our exports. We are setting up an effective retaliation mechanism, together with EU partners." On the same day, French finance ministry sources said if our exports are hit, we will hit American exports. It seems that Paris and Berlin are spearheading a plan, in concert with Rome and Madrid. This plan is being considered at the Commission table in Brussels, and is maturing into the so-called U.S. tariff retaliation. Sweden is a relatively small player in this picture, but it has an intense exchange cycle with the U.S. in technology and machinery exports. If Washington imposes tariffs on European machinery products, Swedish industry giants could suffer. That's why the Swedish government favors the option of applying a similar tax bracket against U.S. machinery. At the same time, given that global brands such as IKEA have a large market in the U.S., any retaliatory move by the EU would inevitably affect Swedish companies indirectly. EU solidarity is very important in times of crisis. We will act by taking joint decisions. The Swedish trade minister said on April 3rd, 2025, indicating that the Nordic countries will also take a clear stance on the Brussels front. A tax card on alcohol and luxury goods was also on the agenda. On the EU side, the American liquor industry sells whiskey, bourbon rum, and other alcoholic products, worth $5 to $6 billion a year to the European market. France and Spain want an additional tax on these items to protect their wine and liquor producers, wine producers especially in France. Recall that the US has already pulled out a similar tax card and say, we have the right to retaliate. If an additional tariff of around 25% is imposed in this area, the price of American spirits on European shelves could rise, and sales could fall indeed. This scenario has the potential to create political unrest in whiskey-producing states in the US when calculating the total economic impact of all these possible steps. Some research centers in the EU estimate that imports from the US could reach over $360 billion by 2025 if the EU raises tariffs on 20 to 25% of this volume. The direct impact could reach 70, twice $80 billion, however. The EU will not go crazy and impose tariffs on all products. Instead, tariffs on US products worth more than $150 billion are a likely option. This number is large enough that it could easily fall under Trump's systematic approach of what he calls reciprocal tariffs. This would mean a significant market loss for US exporters and a higher cost of American products on European shelves. Retaliation would not only burn the US but also the EU consumer. They warned, but Brussels said, our priority is to respond to these unbalanced tariffs. We wouldn't have gotten to this point if Washington hadn't escalated tensions. It is not yet clear when the EU Commission will launch this plan. It all looks like an emergency action plan. The German Chancellor, the French President, the Italian Prime Minister, and the Spanish Prime Minister meet frequently by teleconference with EU Commission officials to discuss ideas for expanding the list. In April, we will announce a comprehensive package of counter-taxes against the US, reads the official briefing from Brussels. So what will be the economic repercussions of this showdown? Actually, the answer is not very clear. If the European Union retaliates against products from the US, consumers in Europe will buy American goods at higher prices. This could feed inflation, but it could also give European domestic producers an advantage. For example, European steel producers would be favored over US steel. European brands would be bought instead of American cars, thus keeping domestic producers strong through internal market protection. Of course, if the US were to get angry and impose new tariffs, a vicious circle could develop between the two sides. The Trump administration's tax list for Europe is also quite extensive, according to information leaked by sources such as Politico and Reuters. In addition to steel, aluminum, and automobiles, additional tariffs are being considered in many sectors, such as food products, e.g. cheese, wine, pasta, cosmetics, chemical products, and motor equipment. In fact, the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative says that reciprocal tariffs could gradually increase from 10% to 20%, and then to 25% or 30%, while the imposition of tariffs on so-called Independence Day may, in the short term, flatten nationalist sentiments in American domestic politics. In the long term, it could cut U.S. exporters off from the world. Citing the example of the smooth, hollow tariffs during the Great Depression, historians say once the storm of protectionism starts, no one can predict where it will end. If we make this picture a little clearer with numbers, trade between the EU and the US is approaching $1 trillion. Automotive and advanced technologies account for almost a third of this trade. Sectors such as steel, aluminum, food, and textiles also account for a large share. If the EU does indeed impose retaliatory tariffs of 22 to 25%, American exporters could face market losses of more than $150 billion a year. When this loss affects the production chain and employment within the U.S., the Trump administration could come under political pressure. Of course, there could also be some consumers and importers in Europe who would be outraged, saying the products we buy from the U.S. have become more expensive. So a trade war often evolves into a lose-lose scenario. But EU leaders are arguing if we lose, let them lose so that they can come to the table with a fair deal. A similar tough stance that we have seen in Canada and Mexico has started to take shape in Europe. For years, these countries have accommodated U.S. trade moves and foreign policy interests, but recently Trump's America First line has offended even his allies. The EU Commission's statement that this has reached the level of a trade war, not only with China or developing countries, but also with allies, points to one of the most tense periods in transatlantic relations. EU Trade Representative Maros Shevchevich will sit down with member states' ambassadors next week to put the finishing touches on a common list of retaliation. After that, the EU Council and Parliament will have to approve it. If the whole process moves forward at an accelerated pace, additional tariffs on many US products could come into force by the end of this month. Europe would thus abandon the diplomatic middle ground stance it has been pursuing for years and move to counterattack. Of course, it is not yet clear which products will be on the retaliatory list and to what extent, but questions such as whether Germany wants to protect cars while imposing a tax on US vehicles, or whether France wants to protect its wine while imposing a surtax on American liquor, are on the agenda. This reflects differences of interest within the EU. Nevertheless, the common enemy Trump tariffs are likely to have a unifying effect. Europe's major economies seem quite determined on this issue. Media commentaries with the headline, "The EU should show strength against Trump," show that a part of the public supports this idea. But there are also those who believe the opposite, who say we are being dragged into a new trade war. If European importers are importing raw materials, parts and certain agricultural products from the US, these tariffs will put them in a difficult situation. After all, it is not easy to maintain the balance here. At the same time, the EU is warning the US that you cannot use other markets against us. For example, if American agricultural products are turned away at the EU's doorstep, they may be forced to turn to Asian and Middle Eastern markets, where price dumping could occur. We'll see who buys American goods and how it affects world markets, von der Leyen said. This is an approach that accuses the Trump administration of creating an artificial global trade crisis. As can be seen, the verbal confrontation is quite fierce. The BBC and Reuters describe it as the biggest trade war since the Great Depression. Political headlines it is the EU's fight for survival. In a nutshell, the basic 10% tariff imposed by the US plus additional reciprocal tariffs of around 10 to 15%, sometimes escalating to 22 to 25%. This directly hits key sectors of transatlantic trade. The European automotive industry, steel and aluminum producers, the textile and electronics sectors are being hit. If the trade dispute between the EU and the US deepens, global market volatility seems inevitable. Investors are selling stocks because of this uncertainty in the market. Indices such as the Stock 600, DXCAC, 40 are fluctuating. Customs warehouses are overcrowded, and transportation companies are overcrowded or stagnant, and this volatility has already started. European stock markets fell at the opening on Thursday after US President Donald Trump announced stronger than expected trade tariffs. The regional Stock 600 index was down 1.4% at 909 seconds and 0 milliseconds am in London. Big retail names with global supply chains suffered, with German sportswear retailer Adidas down 10.4%. Shipping giant Maersk's Eurozone index, considered a barometer of world trade, fell 7.55%. The Stocks Autos index initially fell more than 2%, as Trump's 25% tariffs on vehicles imported into the US took effect, and were added to existing new tariffs on steel and aluminum. However, the sector pared its losses and traded 0.6% lower. Other sectors in the red included banks down 3.3%, while utility shares, traditionally a defensive play in market turmoil, rose 1.6%. The president announced a series of reciprocal tariffs on more than 180 countries and territories, including a 20% tariff on goods imported from the EU and a 10% tariff on goods imported from the UK. The UK's 100% fell by 1%, while France's CAC 40 and Germany's DAX indices recorded larger losses of 1.6% and 1.5%, respectively. Healthcare stocks rose 0.17% after it was announced that pharmaceutical products are among the goods not subject to reciprocal tariffs. The euro rose 1.13% against the US dollar in morning trading at 10.82, the highest level since October 9th. Experts ask, could this be the European version of the kind of harsh backlash Tesla experienced in Canada? With the sharp sanctions against Tesla, Canada sent a message to both Trump and American giants that we will not bow down. Europe is now preparing to follow a similar line. After all, tariffs may seem to protect domestic producers in the short term, but in the long run, they could turn into a process that wears everyone down. The EU, on the other hand, is of the opinion that if there is going to be attrition, we will not watch, we will try to keep it in balance with retaliation. Some say this could lead to the biggest trade crisis since the 1930s. Others argue that Trump is tough, the EU is tough, will eventually force the parties to meet at the negotiating table, perhaps leading to a new free trade agreement. We will see who is right. What is known for now is that Europe is preparing to impose additional tariffs of 20 to 25% on critical items such as automobiles, steel, aluminum, pharmaceuticals, textiles, electronics, and liquor. Economies such as Germany, France, Italy, Spain, and Sweden are finalizing lists at the ambassadorial level. If these lists go into effect, the prices of U.S. products on European shelves will rise, and U.S. exporters will suffer huge losses. The process is still uncertain, but tensions are rising steadily. So where do you stand? Is this EU restraint justified? Or will it plunge the world into a major trade crisis? Will the Trump administration back down in the face of such a drastic move? Or will it raise the tariff walls even higher and send the global economy into a new shakeup? You can join this debate by sharing your comments. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to be the first to know about new developments. Because the outcome of these tariff wars has the potential to affect not just Europe or the US, but the flow of global trade, inflation, consumer prices, and geopolitical balances. We will have to wait and see whether there will be a negotiated settlement soon, or whether this escalation will escalate into a full-scale trade catastrophe. What we know for now is that Europe is more determined than ever, and will not accept the burden from the US. Take care. We will be back with much hotter developments in the next editions.